Sometimes I think that's probably the best way to do a Zoom meeting.
Okay, we're now streaming live on Facebook. Wonderful.
All right.
I can't do anything.
Are we a go?
Yep. Okay. Yes, we are. Hey, welcome everybody. We're here with Miles and Catherine, and I'm going to turn it to Catherine. And here we are for a cool conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Hello there. My name's Catherine Weller. I'm from Weller Bookworks here in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'd like to welcome you to today's author conversation with Miles Harvey about his latest book, King of Confidence, a tale of utopian dreamers, frontier schemers, true believers, false prophets, and the murder of an American monarch. And if you think that's a lot, wait till we get into the book itself. Before we begin, I do have a bit of housekeeping. Our conversation will be followed by question and answers. So if you do have questions, please type those into the Facebook comments box. Our Weller's events impresario, Lane Richens, will monitor the box throughout and pose your questions to Miles. Also, I do hate to be crass, but it must be said. Book events do not fund themselves, even virtual ones, and authors can't eat praise. So just as in the pre-COVID world, bookstores and authors can only bring you events if you support them. If you enjoy our conversation, if you're intrigued by its subject, and if you can, please buy Miles Harvey's book and buy it from us. Lane will put a link to purchase it in the chat box. You can find it on our website, and all purchases from Weller Bookworks will include a book plate signed by Miles Harvey. So let's talk about Miles Harvey. Miles' previous book is Island of Lost Maps, a true story of cartographic crime. In addition to being a bestseller, this book about a notorious rare map thief named Gilbert Joseph Bland was a Weller Bookworks staff favorite. Miles is the recipient of a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship at the University of Michigan, and his book Painter in a Savage Land was named a Chicago Tribune Best Book of the Year and a book list editor's choice. He teaches creative writing at DePaul University in Chicago, where he is a founding editor of Big Shoulders Books. Miles, welcome to our conversation today.
Oh, Catherine, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here virtually.
Great. Yes, I wish we could actually be together because there's so much to talk about here. But I'll begin by saying I have to confess I was a sucker for King of Confidence from the start because I am endlessly fascinated by the weirdness that was James Jesse Strang, his colony on Beaver Island, and the Stangites. I know I'm not alone in this because yours isn't the only book about King of Earth and Heaven, as he came to be known. But what me made enjoy your book so much was that you don't just place him within Latter-day Saint history or the profoundly troubled time in American history in which he lived, but you demonstrate his and his period's relevance to America today. So that was really cool and new reading for me. Let's start with this though. A lot of people don't know about James Strang. Why don't you begin telling us a bit about him?
Well, you used the word strange story or something like that, Catherine, and I find myself, when I'm telling this story, constantly saying, I am not making this up. So James Jesse Strang was a guy who'd sort of failed at everything he did. He was born in 1813 and he grew up in Western New York. He was a farm boy with huge dreams, just huge dreams, but he was not good at following up on stuff. He was kind of a failed attorney, failed newspaperman. He was a postmaster, but what he was good at is sort of getting people to believe in him. But that cut both ways. He had to leave New York because he ripped someone off on a land deal, and he moved to the Midwest, but what was then called the West, and he remade himself. He had been an atheist, and he went to Nauvoo, Illinois, which was then the hub of the church, and he converted, to this exciting new religion. And the big question is whether he meant it or not. But then Joseph Smith was murdered. And then shortly thereafter, this former failure produces a letter that says it's from Joseph Smith, and it says, "I am handing you the church." And that would be like turning the entire U.S. military over to a private in the army. And we think the letter was a forgery, but Strang slowly convinced a lot of followers that he was the true prophet, the true heir to the LDS Church.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how one can just convince people of anything. Um, what I found fascinating right off the bat with Strang was something you touched on, and I'd like you to expand on that. And that's his early desire. It's his seeming early desire for a life with deep meaning. He was growing up in that time when America was questioning a lot of things. There were a lot of utopian ideals, and it seems like he expressed some of that, but there was also this other side of him.
Yeah, so he grew up in this area called the Burned Over District, and they call this part of Western New York that because it's so many religious fires and political fires and social fires kept burning through there, and that it's where so many exciting things in American culture get started. Of course, it's where the Mormon Church gets started, but all sorts of other religious movements, social justice movements, the, women's movement starts there, and it burns hot there. And so he was sort of affected by all this stuff. And he had kind of two sides. He had this very utopian side, and he had this very cynical side. And they were always at war. One of the things we have is his diaries from when he was late teens, early 20s. And you see both sides there. You see him saying, "I'm an atheist, but I'm not going to tell anyone." But also you see him saying, when I talk about God to people, they really to me. And so I felt like he was always at war with these two sides. The other thing these diaries show, Catherine, is he was just so ambitious. So at one point he talks about how if only I had the chance, I would marry Princess Victoria and become King of England. And he honestly believes it. He has dreams from the start of what he calls royalty and power. So he's obsessed with that idea, and he lives out his dreams.
Yeah. He also had a fascination with Napoleon.
Yeah, that's sort of his cynical side was Napoleon. You know, Napoleon was at manipulating other people, among other things. And I think Strang was drawn to his sort of military prowess. But Strang just lived at a time, you know, this is manifest destiny in the United States, where people were just dreaming big. And it was also the time of the self-made man, we call it. And Strang was definitely that. I mean, he completely recreated himself. Now, this letter I mentioned to you, supposedly from Joseph Smith, we think it's a forgery, and a lot of church leaders called him on it right away. They were like, "This is not from Joseph Smith, although it was a very good forgery. We just don't believe you." But he just kept going. He was in Burlington, Wisconsin, this little town in Wisconsin, and he started digging up plates like Smith had done. And luckily, the only person who could translate those mysterious plates were a guy named James Jesse Strang, and he gladly translated them. And guess what, Catherine? They said he was the true heir to the church. And it kind of just kept going from there. He was really able to draw a large following, in part because of charisma that we don't quite understand. If you see a picture of him, he's not the most handsome man in the world, but there are other things we do understand. He was a good speaker, and he was great at manipulating the media. He was really shrewd about this communications revolution going on in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, some of the new ground that I read in your book was also that concrete history of criminality that he brought to his endeavors, ultimately leading to the discovery of the place that only he could translate and manifest. What was he doing that was like building his skill set almost?
Well, you know, this was a time, so I think the time has, there's some comparison to our time. I think there are times in history when truth becomes very porous and malleable. And this was such a time in United States history, the mid-19th century. There was a communications revolution going on. There was a technological revolution, trains, telegraph, railroads, photo changed our conceptions of space and time. There was just a lot of dislocation. People were searching for something. There had been this huge economic crash. And so Strang was able to come in and kind of enforce his version of the truth. And so he drew a lot of true believers to him. I mean, I think a lot of people who followed him really believed that he was going to bring this about the second coming, first in this little town of Burlington, and later on Beaver Island in the northernmost reaches of Lake Michigan. But he also drew around him some of the great frauds and con men of the 19th century. And what he essentially set up on this island eventually was a colony where he would go out and launch raids. His people would go out and launch raids on nearby settlements, but also just sweep through the Midwest stealing horses and other stuff. And so, again, we see the idealism. I think on some level he may have thought he was a prophet, but also just this opportunism.
Yeah, yeah. So with that opportunism and that letter and those plates that magically appeared after Joseph Smith was assassinated, what were his next steps in developing what we here in Utah know as the Strangites? How did he end up getting these followers and moving to Beaver Island?
Well, he was in this little town of Burlington, Wisconsin, which is about an hour northwest of Chicago, a couple hours actually. And he had one thing. So it kind of came down. I mean, as people who understand the succession crisis know, there were several players in that. But Strang sort of emerged as the biggest competitor to Brigham Young. And he had a couple of things going for him. One was that unlike Young, who sort of at first sort of presented himself as a skilled technocrat, a bureaucrat, a guy who's going to, he said, I'm not a prophet. Well, Strang claimed, I am a prophet. I speak to God, and presented himself as a prophet. And I think that was attractive to a lot of people in Nauvoo. But I think the other thing was just simply good timing. As many people in your audience will know, Strang is emerging right at the time that Nauvoo is falling, right? So these anti-Mormon mobs, helped by the state of Illinois, burn the Mormons out, and we start the Great Migration West. Young starts that. Well, Brigham Young is, as again, many people in your audience know, your part of the country was not really even on good maps then. There was maps, but they were bad. This was a huge leap of faith to go, a couple thousand miles west with Young, who really didn't know where he was going, and really he had a plan, but it was such a risky plan. Well, Strang's saying, hey, I'm just a couple hours away from you, and it's really, really nice here in Wisconsin. Why do you want to go west with this guy? And he used all sorts of scare tactics. One time he wrote an open letter saying to people in the church, do you really want your daughters kidnapped by Indians? And these sort of, just kind of lowest common denominator scare tactics. And I think the other thing that he had going for him was, originally at first, he posed himself as the anti-polygamy heir to the church. So polygamy was an open secret in Nauvoo, practiced by church leaders, and we know now that it was very prevalent. And Strang said, I'm totally against that. And there were many people in Nauvoo who were against it too. And so this guy came along and said, I'm not Brigham Young. I will not have a lot of wives. Of course, he changed that later when he got to this island in northernmost Lake Michigan.
Oh, let's talk about that. There are a few things that are really intriguing non-traditional aspects of Strang's life and practices. One of the things that initially really drew me to him was learning that women, Strangite women, were wearing what were then a couple years later called bloomers, but essentially pants earlier than any other women in the West were. And being a feminist, I took a certain reading on that, but your book gives a certain different reading to that. Why don't you talk about that and then tell us about his teenage nephew with whom he traveled?
I sure will. Well, I gotta say that for me, gender relations in the mid 19th century were one of the most fascinating
Mm,
parts of researching this book. And like a lot of things at that time, Strang kind of serves as a lightning rod, you know? And so one of the things is this, like, there's a lot going on in the women's movement then, even before there was really a women's movement. This woman, Margaret Fuller, wrote this incredible book. I think it's called Women in the 19th Century. I may be getting the title off a little bit, but and it reads like something out of 2020 in a lot of places. I mean, Fuller talks about gender fluidity. And in the terms we talk about them now, she says no one is fully man or fully woman. So there was a lot going on then, and Strang, in one way, embraced that. So he had men of his colony wearing pantaloons really early, and they were on this island in the middle of nowhere, and so they could get away with doing that. But I think pantaloons, after a while, became a way he could enforce order. I think the way to think about pantaloons is like we think about masks sometimes now. That unfortunately we've come to this. That often supporters of President Trump think not wearing masks, or formerly thought not wearing masks, is a show of loyalty. And I think that happened on Beaver Island too. If you wore the pantaloons, you were loyal, and if you didn't, you were disloyal. And those tensions really brewed. But meanwhile, Strang has really interesting gender relations in 1843 and 1849, 49 and 50. He traveled all over the East Coast, and I'm not just talking about for a weekend. This is a long tour to raise funds and recruit members. And his companion on that trip was someone he introduced as his nephew, Charles J. Douglas. There's actually a photograph of this person, quite a handsome young lad, only he's not a young lad. He is a young woman by the name of Elvira Field, who is Strang's first plural wife. And he's traveling with her dressed as a man. And what was really interesting to me was not that some people suspected Mr. Douglas of being a woman, but that many people didn't, because there certainly were doubters. I think one of the really interesting things was dress codes were just so rigid in that time. Women had to wear all these petticoats. There was such a display of femininity in clothing that a lot of people they couldn't quite believe their eyes, because they just couldn't believe that a woman would wear men's clothes. But this woman, Elvira Field, becomes a really important figure in the book. I think she was a really important figure in Strang. And as Charles Douglas, but later just as Strang's first plural wife on Beaver Island, she kind of takes on roles that men would normally take on in this rigid 19th century society. So she's just one of many, many fascinating people in this book.
yeah, yeah. And you did. So tell us a little more about the role she took on.
Well, one of the interesting things she did, so eventually Strang had 5 wives at the time of his death, 4 of them pregnant in 1856. But within that community, his first wife, who was such a much more traditional woman, she left him, but she moved back to his original colony in Wisconsin. And I think it was kind of a marriage of convenience for both of them. But of his wives on Beaver Island, Elvira sort of took the more intellectual, she just was a transgressive person in really interesting ways. And I don't think Strang discouraged her. So for instance, one of the many things Strang was involved with was the first effort to really understand weather fronts in the United States. The brand new or relatively young Smithsonian Institute started what's now what we would think of as crowdsourcing. They contacted people all over the country to every day record the weather and record the barometric pressure, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it was Elvira who did that for Strang. And I just am impressed both by Strang's intellectual curiosity. I mean, I think he was a narcissist, possibly a sociopath. I don't know. I'm not good. I'm not an expert in that stuff, but definitely a narcissist, but also a really intellectually curious one. But also the fact that Elvira was the one who went out every day, got up, despite the fact that she had kids and the other women she was with had kids, and would go and make detailed weather recordings, and did this for years. And as a result, not just of them, but of this huge sort of crowd movement, the weather systems we now understand, like moving west to east, like we didn't really understand how weather fronts moved. And as a result of this amazing Smithsonian project, we now understand it.
Yeah, they did a lot of very interesting things, and transgression was part of that. It's because that history of criminality, not just transgression, but criminality followed James Jesse Strang to the island. And there were other activities that they were involved in that it sounds like really made it possible for them to continue to live there.
Well, yeah, in one way, Strang was very shrewd and very forward-looking, like a lot of things. The thing I love about this guy as a writer is he's just such a three-dimensional, contradictory figure, which is, a writer's just a dream. And so he identified early on that the island, the one commodity the island had was wood. And this was not a small thing because at the time, railroads hadn't come through the Midwest. So to get from Detroit to Chicago, you had to do this long, circuitous route through the Great Lakes. And Beaver Island was a stopping point. So all the steamboats needed that wood. But wood was also vital to settling the prairie. Pine trees from the northern Midwest are what made the prairies of the southern and western Midwest possible. And so he was very shrewd about that. And in fact, in this book of Revelation, sort of a Bible/Constitution that he eventually presented to his people as divine revelation from God, one of the things in there is like, if you cut down trees, you got to grow trees. I mean, he was way ahead of his time on that. He was very, and he's true. Just he understood that they had a small island and that they needed to keep growing trees. But I was really struck by that. Well, the other thing the island was good for was setting up this criminal colony. And other books, not all of them, but some, there's been some question. One author just said, look, this is all anti-Mormon bias. There's no proof that he was involved in any of these crimes. And I got to say, there was a ton of a bias against the church in the Midwest. We know that, and it was rampant, and it was terrible. But one of the things I really push forward in my research is finding much stronger evidence that Strang was personally involved in these crimes. Like there's this part of the book that's brand new research where in this little town in Ohio, get real-time reporting, not after the fact, but real-time reporting with names and names. So this horse thief comes to town, a posse goes out after him, he's brought back. It's one of Strang's top lieutenants, sort of an enforcer type of his. He gets put on trial, gets put in jail. Strang comes to town, apparently with some other people. The local newspaper man says, I think there's going to be a jailbreak. The guy is convicted of horse theft, but there's a technicality that the sheriff didn't sign some paper thing, and the local papers all over the sheriff saying, basically implying that he took some bribes. And so the guy doesn't go to state prison. He stays in that jail. And sure enough, there's a jailbreak and he shows up back on Beaver Island. Well, this really places Strang at the scene of the crime. And I've done that in a couple other instances as well, where I've just really pinned down a little bit more what we're doing. And so it's quite possible that all of the crimes he was accused of, which were a lot, what he is doing, and it's quite possible that other criminal gangs were pretending to be part of his church when they raided people and whatnot. But it's also absolutely true that he was involved in a criminal activity, that he was surrounded by a group of really notorious um, con men and guys who were not interested necessarily in other people's best interests.
Yeah, he was surrounded by those people and by those true believers too. And that's really a potent mixture for enabling all kinds of behaviors that ultimately manifest in what I thought was him becoming king of Beaver Island, but in fact was him becoming king of earth and heaven. Tell us a bit about his coronation.
As I said, he had always wanted to be king since he was a young man and had talked about, how he would marry Princess Victoria if he just got the chance, just if I could just meet her. Yeah, I know I'd become king of England. Well, he had in 1850, there was a real coronation on Beaver Island where he took the throne, which was stuffed with tree moss as his padding. And there was one closest aides was this notorious conman, George Adams, who was a Shakespearean actor slash Mormon preacher. And Adams had a bunch of stage props that they used. And, it's easy to laugh at this notion of him as king, but I think he might have taken it fairly seriously. His people, and interestingly, the US president also did. Millard Fillmore was concerned, as were his aides, about a quasi-independent kingdom on US soil, that they sent in the Navy's first iron-hulled warship to raid this island and bring Strang to justice. And he was hauled back, along with many of his followers, to Detroit and put on trial. And partly because he was a good attorney, and partly because the prosecution did a bad job, he was found innocent on all charges, and then the charges were dropped. And so in 1853, Millard Fillmore left office as one of the least liked, least successful, most forgettable American presidents. And as the US president who went after him left office, Strang was still king. So he outlasted a US president. So that's not a small thing.
That that's actually a pretty big thing, I think. Um, there's this really big thread that runs through your book. It's part of the title, and that is the King of Confidence. Would you talk about the confidence, that confidence man then, not just Strang, but that whole milieu that was happening, and if you see any lasting reverberations of the confidence man in throughout American history up to today?
Yeah. So, yeah, as you said, this period that Strang lived in was a really unstable period where basic truths were in question. And it's the reason that other people like him thrive. This is the age of P.T. Barnum, who we may now think of more as a circus impresario, but was mostly a public hoaxer then. He had a museum where he'd say, I have a mermaid on display. And people would come, and some people would say, that's a mermaid. But most people would say, that's a monkey stitched to a fish. And Barnum would just say, is it? Why don't you bring your mother and ask her? And by the way, I'll take your mother's money too. But it's also when we get the term confidence man. We know exactly when this term starts in 1849. And it's in a newspaper in New York about a small-time thief, but it spreads through the American lexicon with lightning speed. And it's because there were so many people at all levels of society who were playing other people and taking advantage of them. And so Strang is very much of his time. Now, of course, all over the world and all through history, there have been confidence artists, whether they go by that name or not. But I do think there may be a kind of particularly American strain. Charles Dickens, the novelist, came here in 1842 and came to a place very much like a couple of Strang's colonies, where he just saw like people pulling off these terrible land scams. And he was talking to people. This is in Cairo, Illinois, at the southern tip of Illinois. And he was talking to people about it. And he was really surprised that people were impressed by the guy pulling off the scam. And he said, isn't this guy dishonest? And they said, yeah, he is. He's dishonest. Didn't he hurt a lot of people? Oh, sure. Yeah, he definitely hurt a lot of people. Doesn't he deserve to go to jail? Oh, yeah, of course he does. But why do you like him? And they said he's a smart man. And there's somehow something I think Dickens was saying about the big lie that Americans are attracted to. I don't mention times in the book to answer your question, Catherine.
Mhm.
Two very oblique references to them, but I think we live in an equally unstable time where truth is very much contested and malleable, and I think our time is open to people like Strang. So although my book is about the 1840s and 1850s, a lot of people are reading it as kind of a parable for 2020. And I got to say that although I purposely didn't mention 2020 or President Trump or anything about that, I'm glad for that. I'm an English professor, and so I really believe strongly in the humanities. And I think when they work well, what the humanities do is allow us to understand the present and the future through the past. And I do think that I'm really gratified that people are saying, well, this gives me a filter, and a really useful filter, on what's going on in our culture now.
It really does. Thank you. That I saw more parallels with today than I was comfortable with. I was actually kind of surprised by that. My last question for you is, confidence men, or con men, as we often say now, are often come to bad ends. Not always, often do. King Strang did come to a bad end, and without getting too specific about his bad end, I'd like to leave that for the book. Would you talk about what you thought it was that finally led to that bad end? What was it that just had people saying, okay, done?
Well, I guess as far as the spoiler alert goes, it's in the subtitle of the book, so he gets he gets murdered. So I can't I can't. But I think the interesting thing about the book is the way he gets there, and I think it was a combination of things. Ostensibly, we talked about pantaloons, which people out Island almost a year before the women's rights advocate Amelia Bloomer started wearing them, and they became known as bloomers, as this symbol of feminism or proto-feminism. But these pantaloons kind of turned the other way. They became like a big symbol for both Strang's supporters and opponents, and he apparently cracked and said all women on the island will wear bloomers. And I don't really know what that was about, but I think it's quite possible that was just an assertion of when he was losing it, right? He just said, I'm in charge here, and I'm making this demand on you. And so ostensibly, Strang's, the conspirators who got together to kill Strang, in some ways they were angry about bloomers, but it was much more than that. I think polygamy came into it. I think a lot of people on the island had come there because they weren't comfortable with polygamy, and then Strang and his top leaders started practicing it. And I think they just, even this woman Elvira, his first plural wife, said, people on the island just weren't comfortable with it. She wrote later. But I think in general, it just was a lot of things. And meanwhile, Strang had made a lot of enemies off the island. The local fishermen all sort of hated him. And I'm sure both sides were not flawless, but and obviously people along the shore didn't like him either, because his people had been raiding them. And the U.S. government didn't like him because they'd lost a case. And so these conspirators eventually got help, almost for sure from the U.S. government, at least tacit help, and probably from the state of Michigan as well. And in 1856, a group of conspirators, or a couple of henchmen, but it was part of a larger group of conspirators, gunned him down and paralyzed him below the waist, and eventually he died.
It was a bad end. But what a fascinating man. Miles, what I'd like to do is I've been so involved talking with you that I haven't been able to look into the chat box and check and see if there are questions there. So this is where I'm going to pull in Lane and see if our audience here today has any questions for you before we sign off. Lane?
Hi, Miles. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can, Lane.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lane. I'm the events coordinator here. I'm just going to relay a few of the questions that we've seen coming through on Facebook. Miles, we have a question from Ted here, and Ted would like to know, how long did you do research for this book?
So about 5 years. And the interesting thing for me was that those 5 years overlapped with President Trump's candidacy election and presidency. Um, and so I worked pretty fast on this book. And sometimes I think I just am at a certain in my writing career where, I mean, 5 years for me is fast, but where I just am efficient, and I knew what I wanted to do with this book from the start. But I think also, I think living in the era we live in now and writing about a similar era was helpful. But in any case, I don't think this would have been the same book if I'd written it at a different period in US history. So I think in some ways Strang gave me insights into Trump, and in some ways Trump gave me insights into Strang. And so that was an interesting aspect of working on this book.
Morris here has a question. He would like to know what originally led you to your interest in writing about Strang.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first time I ever heard about James Jesse Strang was about, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. I mentioned that his first utopian colony was in this little town called Burlington, Wisconsin. And by coincidence, I have a brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Chris Carr, who's also a close friend of mine. And we were up visiting his parents. And I just remember driving around town with Chris. It was the first time I was there. And he started pointing to these beautiful old, there's very simple buildings in right by where he lives, and saying, there used to be this, Mormon colony here. And he told me something about its leader, and then I remember Chris saying, and I grew up with the remnants of the Strangite church, with the kids who were descended from the remnants of the Strangite church. I remember thinking that was really interesting, and then I didn't think about Strang all that much until 5 or 6 years ago, when an editor from Little Brown, a guy by the name of Ben George, got a hold of me through my agent, and kind of out of the blue asked me if I would be interested in writing a book on this guy. At first I was a little skeptical just because it wasn't my idea. But then I quickly realized this was like a dream book to write, and was right in my skill set, which is, I think, probably why Ben identified me. And it was just a great collaboration with this editor. So I got really lucky on this one. It's not often that even come to him and say, hey, we're thinking about this book. And of course, I had to do a lot of work. My book proposal was more than 100 pages long, and took me a long time to develop. And there was no guarantee that it would go through, but it was, with an editor behind me, it was a good shot, and it's been a great experience. Working with Ben George, he's just a wonderful editor, and just a great kind of collaborator in a kind of way that doesn't exist in the publishing industry much anymore, kind of hands-on. Let's talk about this, let's talk about this. And it was really fun to work with him, and really rewarding.
We have just a couple more here. One from Dave, asking what your favorite anecdote from Strang's life is.
I mean, there's so many anecdotes that are so weird and wonderful. But guess I think the first time I saw that photograph of Elvira was Charles J. Douglas. It still exists. It's in the book. I thought, well, this guy's more than just because that, of course, is a con. I mean, that's an epic con, right? Traveling with this nephew, and he's my private secretary, and well, we're going back to the hotel now to get some rest, But he but I thought, this guy, there's something really huge about him. And, so
Uh-huh.
I guess that would be the anecdote that sort of got me at first, where I thought, well, this isn't just your run of the mill fraud. This guy's really interesting and multidimensional. And he proved to be that.
Okay, this one's from Megan Miles. This may be the last question we have. Um, she just wants to know what other projects you're working on at the moment.
That's a great question. I I am looking for a new. I have a bad habit of not taking downtime, but just I'm slow at everything I do, including writing and thinking. I once wrote, and I think it's true, that I'm only in slow motion, like, which is why I'm an intelligent human being. But in the moment, I'm just struggling with each sentence. And so I'm working on some nonfiction book projects, and I've always written short fiction just for fun and published it, and and especially not fun. And otherwise, I'm a full-time college teacher, so before and after this conversation, I'll be preparing for classes, which I'm teaching online in the fall.
Well, it looks like that's about all we have on questions there. So I'm just going to come in here with my video and just say thank you, Miles, for being here. It's been wonderful having communication with you over the last few weeks.
Vice versa, Lane and Catherine. I'm so grateful to both of you. And can I just reinforce something Catherine said earlier? And Catherine, I'm so glad you said that. I've been kind of urging people who are tuned into these virtual. The great thing about these events is you get a lot of people to them sometimes, and they're from all over. I love it that my friends from Europe can tune into these things and see me talk. But they don't always have a lot of sales. And I guess I want a hard sell for the book. Like, it's hard to browse bookstores now. And so if this interested you, just buy the book. But also, please support Weller. I mean, bookstores like this are such an important cultural institution, and they're really in dire shape, and we need to support them. So I just hope people will do that, and that's just my thing.
Thank you.
That's so kind of you. Sort of just here's the King of Confidence. There's the copy of it right there. We're linked to it on our Facebook page. You can go through our website if you don't have that link, or you can call us at the store. And just sort of piggyback on what Miles was just saying, we just opened back up to foot traffic 1 week ago. So we are now open 12 to 5 in store. We are also still available and willing to fill online orders, and we can do a curbside still if that is your preference. But you can finally come in and walk around the stacks once again, and we would love to see you. Miles, before I just give a final sign off, just again, thank you. And this has been a beautiful little discussion.
It's
Thank
been
you both.
wonderful. Thank you,
Thank
Miles.
Thank you. I really am grateful to be here and honored.
And as I sign out here, as I do usually, I would just like to tell everybody, be nice, buy books, wear your masks, and come see us. We love you all. Thank you for joining us. We will see you soon. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.